What are modules? Well, first, let's ask ourselves, what are programs in general? They're simply a way for us to modify data, modify variables. Because so much of our code is just about modifying data and how we organize these variables within our code, the way we structure this data should be the most important part of our program, because it's going to allow us to have more maintainable code. Now, as humans, in our head, if we just had a few variables to think about, that's easy, right? We don't really need multiple files in JavaScript. We just need one file. And because of JavaScript's functional scope, we don't even have to think about all the functions in our program. Because of how scope works in JavaScript, and functions can't have access to variables that are defined in other functions, well, we can just, in our head, keep the variables that we're currently using. For example, if I had a sign-in function, well, and I'm writing this function, I don't have to worry necessarily about me creating a, let's say, text field variable. And I can set it to whatever I want. This text field, because of function scope and the way it works in JavaScript, isn't going to be modified by anybody outside of it. So that if I have another function, let's say function is human, because when people sign in, we want to make sure that they are human, I can once again start working on this function and not really care about what this function is doing with its piece of data because, well, I don't really have access to text field. I have access to my own variables. And this is great, right? This is completely manageable. It means that we're working on one function at a time and think about that one function only. But it does have a downside, right? Because without talking to other functions, without talking to other pieces of data outside of ourselves, well, we can't really write programs, do we? We need a way to share data between these different functions. So how do we do this? Well, if we had a user variable that was an object, we can simply put it on the scope outside of, let's say, a function, so that both functions have access to it. So that now, when I call these functions, I can perhaps pass in the user parameter, so that we have access to this shared piece of data. And that's how we've done things. We just move the piece of data that we need to share up the scope chain to a parent that can share this piece of data with its children. For example, on the global scope. Now, what's the problem with this code? When we first start writing bigger and bigger programs, and we have this piece of code that we keep extending, keep adding data and variables to our global scope. Well, we know that we have the idea of tight coupling, which simply means that everything is connected really, really tightly. So that if I modify the user object, for example, who knows what effect might have in other parts of the file, other functions, maybe some function really needed the user to have the name property, but in another function, I changed the name property to perhaps nickname. That's tight coupling. It means a lot of things having to depend on one another. This also creates hard to debug code because so many things can happen that can modify data. And as we've talked before, polluting the global namespace causes possible memory leaks, where we have limited amount of memory on our window object, for example. And, well, we're just adding more and more data to it. Okay, so let's solve this problem. We have a massive file with 1,000 lines of JavaScript, but we're polluting the global namespace. There's too many global variables, too many things depending on one another. They're tightly coupled. How can we fix it? And you might be asking yourself, well, that's no problem. I can just have a an HTML file, and I'll include all my script files. I'll just divide up the code and perhaps add different script files, script 2, script 3, and then I don't have to worry about anything, right? Well, not really, because the way we've had it in the past is that simply adding script files to, let's say, an HTML file, the browser doesn't really care that you've put code in separate files. When it's evaluating the JavaScript, it just combines all these files together. So you might as well just have put everything into one file, because any variable that you declare in that script on the global scope of that script is going to be a global variable in the entire web page. And on top of that, the dependencies between these different parts of your code are what we call implicit. We're not defining it, it's just they kind of figure out on their own what's depending on what's modifying the data. Any function can grab anything on the global scope, so you don't know which functions depend on which scripts. Let's do a little example. I have a fun little function here called fight. And fight, well, accepts two parameters and it makes them fight. Two characters that makes them fight. And in our case, we have Harry and Voldemort. Now, all I'm doing here is I'm doing math.random, which generates a number from 0 to 1, and then I multiply that by the character length. So in that case, I'm multiplying math random by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then doing math.floor so that we get a whole number, an integer. And I'm doing the same here. If I console log this and do attack 1, I'm just randomly generating a number, for Harry at least, between 0 and 5. Now, yes, this function is not very good because if you have a longer name, well, you have a higher chance of actually winning because we compare which is higher and then one wins over the other. In this case, he who must not be named wins. And most of the time, well, Voldemort wins. But every once in a while, Harry prevails as well. Now, this silly little function, if I copy and paste this into, let's say, my script file, just like this, and we don't need to call this for now. If I save this, and we see that we have the script file in our HTML page, let's open our index.html file. And then now we should be able to have access to fight, which is a function. So that if I do fight Harry and Voldemort, there you go. Voldemort wins again. And that's because, well, everything that we define in this file is going to be part of the global scope unless we define it inside of a function. And the problem arises when we have another script. And this script simply says variable fight equals haha. Oh, I have to make sure that I close the string. Let's refresh again. And I do fight. Uh-oh. I've just overridden my fight function that I worked really, really hard to build. Okay, well, can't I just move this up here so that this script gets read after? If I refresh and do fight, yep, I have the function there. But this is not good, right? This is one of the major problems without modules. Because these variables are on global scope, every part of the code that's inside of that file can change a variable. So that you start to have really hard code to debug. And as you get bigger and bigger with your JavaScript, it becomes impossible to maintain. And any serious language has a way to handle modules. Because you cannot build large applications without module. So how do we solve this? Well, back in the day, we used to just have one page of JavaScript, like I've showed you. And that was easy enough because web pages, in the 90s especially, were very simple JavaScript. Nothing too crazy, maybe a form here and there. But things started getting bigger and bigger. We have really complex web applications now. So we can no longer keep everything in our head. We can no longer just have one JavaScript file and know how each piece of data is being touched by a function. Most of the time, we're working in teams with tens, hundreds, thousands of developers. So how do we do this in JavaScript? Now, JavaScript has a thing called ES module. That is a module system that is native to JavaScript now. But this happened quite recently. What did we do before? Before I show you how things work now, I want to show you how we solve this problem of modules so that we have a bit of a historical context because some codebases still use these older methods. So let's get started with the first solution to this problem. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.